in this video I'm going to discuss how to cut the Victorian shirt with fabric that is doubled. I chose a print so that you could see the wrong side is plain and then the print is on this side. So I have this fabric folded so it is wrong sides together. That is because I'm going to use tracing paper between, and the tracing paper is also doubled. I like to do this doubled method of cutting and marking because you can cut and mark two layers at one time. So if the fabric is wrong sides together and your tracing paper is doubled, you can slide the tracing paper between the fabric and with the tracing wheel trace around your paper pattern, and what that does is marks both sides of the fabric on the wrong side, both layers of fabric at the same time. As I've discussed in previous videos, the main difference between commercial patterns and these patterns we make for theater is that these patterns don't have any seam allowance on them. That's because in theater we often add extra seam allowance at the side or at the bottom for alterability over the life of the garment. And so those 5/8 inch commercial pattern seam allowances just won't work for us. So this pattern has no seam allowance on it. So we need to allow seam allowance as we are placing it. This center back of the shirt back needs to be placed on the fold. That's the fold. Here is the selvage. The selvage is that tightly woven edge that runs the length of the goods. This is the lengthwise grain. So we're going to place this running the paper pattern down the center back fold here, leaving room here for seam allowance. I like to chalk mark with the ruler the seam allowance, but first I like to place all my pattern pieces first. If you start chalk marking and then find you need to shift the pattern back and forth to get the optimum layout to maximize the use of the fabric, if you've already chalk marked, then there you are with chalk on the fabric and you may need to move your pattern. So let's lay the entire pattern out first and then chalk mark the seam lines and or the cutting line. So I know that I'm going to leave about an inch or so at the side seam, so here I am leaving that. And then I need to leave some room here for this pattern piece. So this back yoke fits pretty well in here. This back line of the yoke is truly a straight line, so I know that I can run it parallel to this selvage. Try to place it so that you're not including the selvage in with your seam allowance. The selvage is a more tightly woven edge, and we don't want to include that in our seams. It will act differently in the washing and drying and the making up. So we want to make sure to keep this away from the selvage, and when we mark and cut, we will cut the selvage off. So I'm moving down the fabric, and you'll notice that here is my shirt front, and here is the center front that needs to be on the fold, except the fold is over there. Because this is fabric that is doubled, we can simply turn this over. It will still create the pattern fabric shape that we want. We can just flip it over that way, slide it down, further down off camera, and pin that in place. Following our grain lines, these grain lines want to run parallel to the selvage edge. That's how we know we are on grain. That would go there. This doesn't leave enough room for seam allowance, so I'm going to move that down, and I'm moving off of camera now, but following this same grain line, placing it all along the length of the goods. Once you have all the pattern pieces pinned and room left for seam allowance, then with your clear view ruler and chalk, you can start marking seam allowance. Now I'm making this for someone and we're going to have a fitting on it. We're going to stitch it up partially, have a fitting, and then finish it after. So I'm wanting to leave myself a little wiggle room so that if I need to let out seams, I can. So I want extra seam allowance. For example, one of the places I might want extra seam allowance is at the shoulder. If we want to drop the shoulder line on the actor, we might want extra seam allowance there. So I'm going to mark 1.5 inches seam allowance there. And chalk breaks. That's just the way it does. Don't worry about it. That just means you now have 3 pieces of chalk instead of 1. The shoulder seam here is not an alteration point, so I'm going to just do 1/2 inch seam allowance there. If you know that it's not an alteration point, and you know that you're going to be trimming, grading, and trimming this bulk of the seam allowance down anyway, why add a lot of seam allowance there? I'm pretty confident of the neckline, so there again I'm going to have 1/2 inch seam allowance, and so forth all the way around. Whatever extra you put on one piece, this is just like the truing, you would also need to put extra on the piece it gets stitched to. So you would need to add 1.5 inches seam allowance here, because this is the back that gets stitched here, and then you would probably taper down to nothing in the in the armpit area here. Once you have all of your cutting lines marked, then you can go ahead and cut on them. So once you have all of the pieces cut out, then you can use the tracing paper and wheel to mark all the seam lines. Mark those lines from cut edge to cut edge, because you're going to want to stitch from cut edge to cut edge. So mark them all the way to the cut edge. Be sure to mark the notches all the way around. You'll miss those later in the stitching if you don't have them marked here. And so forth, all the way around. Normally in theater, the draper is going to be doing all the cutting and then handing projects to the stitcher. So I like to transfer some of these notations very lightly with pencil on the inside in the seam allowance. This is just a breadcrumb trail for our stitchers, so they can keep track of what piece and what's going together and so forth. So here at this shoulder notch, I would write SH very lightly. With the tracing paper and the marking this way, you want to do a test at first, before you even start, to make sure that the tracing paper and your pencil doesn't bleed through, meaning you're not so heavy-handed that the pencil line is visible on the outside. That's terrible. That's a terrible thing to do. Don't do it. Do the test first, and don't be heavy-handed with your pencil. You'll want to go around, mark on the inside the center back notch here, the center back notch here, and the notches where the pleats go. You would proceed in the same fashion on all the rest of the pieces.